By the fourth night of the Blackfoot storm, Iron Creek Hollow had disappeared beneath a rolling wall of white. Wind hammered the ridge at more than 55 miles an hour. The mercury had dropped to 31 below. Snow packed against the north wall of the farmhouse until only the chimney and a strip of the roof still cut against the sky. In the west field, the newly framed cattle shed groaned under the weight of drifting snow. Ezra Callahan wedged his shoulder against the collapsing brace and shouted for Cora Ashfield to hand him the mallet. If the brace failed now, the roof would cave onto the pregnant heifers sheltering below. Inside the farmhouse, Micah kept the fire fed while listening for his father's whistle through the storm. Rosalie slept in a woven basket beside the stove. A neighbor's boy, half frozen and dragged from the drifts hours before, muttered feverishly beneath a wool blanket. Then the mallet fell silent. Cora's gloved hand tightened on the guide rope. Only 7 weeks earlier, Ezra had arrived at the farm gate begging for a single meal for his children. How had it come to this, that the fate of Iron Creek Hollow now rested on his ability to keep one bent shoulder pressed against a splintering beam? Late in October of 1888, Ezra Callahan reached Iron Creek Hollow with nothing but a battered handcart and 2 children. He was only 41, yet the road had already worn him down. His coat had been mended so many times the original wool was hardly visible. One hand hauled the cart, the other cradled 14-month-old Rosalie against his chest. 8-year-old Micah walked beside the wheel without asking how much farther they had to go. Ezra had spent 11 years building barns, granaries, sawmills, and water wheels along the northern Pacific line. After his wife, Adelaide, died in a fever that swept through the mill camp the previous spring, he could no longer travel with a crew and keep 2 children fed. 4 farms had already turned them away that autumn. One offered a single meal but no shelter. Another let them sleep in a hay loft for one night before pointing them back down the road. A church wife suggested Rosalie would grow up healthier if Ezra placed her with a childless couple in the next county. Ezra had walked away before she finished the sentence. On their final morning before reaching Iron Creek Hollow, Rosalie would only take a spoonful of thin oat gruel. Micah tore his last biscuit into halves, tucked one deep into his coat pocket, and told his father he had already eaten. Ezra saw it and understood what it meant. His son no longer trusted that supper would come again. Then, past a wind-bent line of cottonwoods, Iron Creek Hollow rose out of the prairie. The main barn leaned 3 degrees off true. Its wide double doors faced due north, straight into the coming wind. A cracked stone foundation showed daylight through its seams. The chimney breathed pale smoke, but beyond the split-rail fence, a small herd of red-end white heifers stood alive and healthy in the corral. Cora Ashfield, the widowed owner of Iron Creek Hollow, stood beside the well pump, wrapping a length of burlap around the exposed collar. She turned when she heard the handcart wheel squeal on the frozen ruts and studied the stranger and his 2 children before speaking a single word. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows despite the cold. A tally book was tucked under her belt. One boot heel had worn crooked from years of setting fence posts. Nothing about her suggested a woman waiting for anyone to save her. "What kind of work have you done?" she asked. Ezra answered plainly without offering the story of how he had come to stand at her gate. Barn frames, granaries, water pumps, wagon repair, roofs, doors, fencing. "And what is it you need?" His eyes moved to Rosalie, who was chewing the corner of her blanket because hunger had lasted longer than crying. "Feed my kids. Give us a corner out of the wind. I'll rebuild your barn before winter takes it down." Cora did not answer at once. She looked toward the leaning structure behind her, then at the boy pressing his sleeve against his brother's back as though shielding him from her judgment. "What makes you think my barn is going down?" Ezra lifted one hand toward the buildings beyond the gate. "Your doors face the wrong wind. Your foundation is shifting east because water has been pooling on the uphill side for years, and the ridge beam is already carrying a twist. Come January, one bad night and that roof will pull the whole north wall with it." Silence stretched between them. Confidence was cheap on the frontier. Proof was not. Cora looked at Micah, then at Rosalie asleep against Ezra's shoulder and stepped forward without answering the accusations against her barn. She reached out and gently took the sleeping child into her own arms. "Supper comes first," she said quietly. "Your claims can wait until morning." Cora led them into a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and simmering beans. She set Rosalie into a padded chair near the stove, warmed a small pan of milk with a spoonful of cream, and tested it against the inside of her wrist before handing it to Ezra. "Slow sips," she said. "Her stomach won't remember how to hold much." A bowl of thick venison stew appeared in front of Micah, along with a wedge of dark bread and 2 pickled crab apples. Another bowl waited for Ezra even after he quietly said he did not need one. Micah ate without lifting his eyes. Before he was halfway through, he slid the untouched half of his bread into his coat pocket. Cora saw it. She said nothing. Instead, she laid a second slice beside his bowl as though it had always been there. Across the table, Ezra tried to feed Rosalie, but his hands shook so badly from cold and hunger that the milk kept slipping down her chin. Without a word, Cora reached across and steadied the bottom of the cup with one steady hand, never taking the child from him. Between careful bites, they traded only the facts that mattered. Adelaide had died of camp fever the previous May. Rosalie had been only 8 months old. Rowan Ashfield, Cora's late husband and the original builder of Iron Creek Hollow, had died 2 winters earlier, thrown from a horse on a river crossing when the ice gave way beneath him. Cora had never had children. The farm was carrying a mortgage held by a bank in Butte, and last spring's calf loss had put her one bad season away from foreclosure. Later that night, Cora opened the door to a small back room that had once been a foreman's quarters. From an old chest at the foot of the bed, she lifted out a folded quilt stitched in blue and cream. She spread it across the mattress without ceremony, then carried a cushioned crate down from the loft and set it beside the stove for Rosalie. Ezra noticed the crate had been sanded smooth on the inside, as though someone had once meant it for a purpose it never served. That night, Rosalie slept without waking. Micah fell asleep with one hand still gripping the hoarded bread in his pocket, as if letting go might make it vanish. Before the first light touched the eastern ridge, Ezra was already outside, walking the property line. He did not pick up a hammer. He did not move a single tool. He watched first. A short strip of red flannel tied to the barn door showed him how the wind curled beneath the sill and slipped between the loose boards. He knelt at the base of the north wall and pressed his palm against the stone. It was damp 2 feet above the ground, where dampness had no business being. He walked slowly around the foundation, marking with a stick of chalk each spot where the mortar had crumbled or the sill had rotted. Cora followed him without announcing herself. When Ezra finally spoke, he pointed instead of gesturing. "The barn is not falling because it was built poorly. It is falling because the land shifted around it. The uphill grade sends water straight against your north footing every spring. 10 years of freeze and thaw did the rest." He knelt at the corner of the barn where the sill met the stone. "This joist has already pulled half an inch from where it should sit. Come the first hard thaw, it will drop the rest of the way." His hand rested against the double doors, and these swing outward into the wind. Every gust wedges them tighter against the hinges until the frame itself begins to twist. That's why your ridge beam has a bow in it. Cora folded her arms. "Rowan set those doors himself." Ezra shook his head. He wasn't wrong. The prevailing wind ran east to west when he built this. The weather changed. The wall didn't. Some of the tension left her jaw. Ezra walked to the top of the small rise where the wind was strongest and looked back at the farm. 7 weeks, he said. Foundation first, then the sill and joist. Then the doors moved to the east wall, fresh chinking. A drainage ditch dug uphill of the barn before the ground freezes solid. Cora studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the tool shed. "You have 1 week," she said. "Then I'll decide whether you truly see problems or invent them to keep a warm bed." Ezra began with the work least likely to draw an argument. The drainage came first. Together, he and Micah walked the slope above the barn while Cora sighted the line with a length of twine and a plumb bob salvaged from Rowan's old carpentry box. The ditch would run in a shallow curve, catching the runoff from the higher ground and sending it well east of the foundation before releasing it into the creek bed below. 2 feet wide at the top, Ezra told Micah. 18 inches deep at the low end. The bottom slopes down 1 inch every 10 feet. Any less and the water sits. Any more and the ditch itself washes out. Micah's job was to measure. He carried a marked stick and called out each depth as his father dug. It was the most he had spoken since arriving. When his palms blistered by midday, he did not stop. When Cora saw the blisters, she quietly set a pair of Rowan's smaller work gloves beside him at supper. Micah slid his hands into them without a word, but he wore them every morning after. The foundation came next. Ezra opened a test pit at the northwest corner and confirmed what his palm had told him. The stone had shifted almost an inch on its bed of frost-damaged mortar. The sill above it was soft in 3 places, the wood spongy where water had wicked upward year after year. "We cannot rebuild the whole foundation before the ground freezes," he told Cora. "But we can save the north wall if we jack the sill, cut out the rotted sections, replace them with fresh oak and repoint the stone where it meets the wood." Cora studied the pit. "How many days?" 9, maybe 10 if the weather turns. "Then we do not waste one." The oak came from a stand of trees along the creek that Rowan had felled and cured 3 summers earlier. Cora led Ezra to the shed where the timber had been stacked. When she brushed the dust from the top board, Ezra saw a chalk mark in a steady hand, East Barn Sill, Spring '86. Rowan had cut this wood for exactly this repair and never lived to make it. Cora ran her thumb across the mark, then handed the board to Ezra. He would have wanted it used. They set the jacks that afternoon. Slowly, 1 turn at a time, the north sill of the barn lifted a 1/4 inch, then a half, then the full 3/4 they needed. Ezra sawed out the rotted sections and fitted the new oak in place, packing the gap between wood and stone with a fresh mortar of lime, sand, and animal hair, a mixture Cora recommended after watching him mix the first failed batch. "My father sealed sheep sheds with more hair and less lime," she said. "It grips the stone instead of shrinking away from it." Ezra nodded once and mixed a new batch. This one held. On the 4th evening, an old neighbor named Prudence Hollies rode up on a shaggy mule with a covered basket balanced across the saddle. She had heard from a passing freighter that Cora Ashfield had taken in a widower and his children. She wanted to see for herself. Prudence Hollies was 72 years old, sharp-eyed, and one of the few people in Iron Creek Basin who had known Rowan since boyhood. She sat at Cora's kitchen table, accepted a cup of chicory coffee, and watched Micah shell dry peas into a bowl for the better part of an hour before she spoke. "That boy carries too much for his size," she said quietly to Cora. "He is learning to set it down." Prudence looked toward Rosalie, asleep in the padded crate beside the stove. "And that one has already forgotten how heavy her father's arms were." She turned her steady gaze on Cora. "Silas Marrow has been asking about your new man in town." Cora did not answer at once. Silas Marrow owned the largest cattle operation in Iron Creek Basin. After Rowan's death, he had offered to buy Cora's land for a price that would have covered the mortgage and left her nothing. She had refused. Ever since, he had spoken of Iron Creek Hollow as though its ruin were only a matter of time. "Let him ask," Cora said finally. "He will find no answers here worth carrying home." Prudence set 2 loaves of dark bread on the table before she left. As she pulled on her mittens, she paused at the door and looked back at Ezra bent over his chalk marks on the barn wall. "He works like a man who intends to stay," she said. Cora did not reply. But that night when she wrote in the farm ledger, she noted the day's work under a new heading, Repairs, Iron Creek Hollow, Foreman E. Callahan. By the 6th day, the new oak sill had settled fully onto its bed of fresh mortar. The north wall no longer bowed inward at its base. Ezra tested the joint by pressing his shoulder against the wall and shifting his weight. Nothing gave. The barn had already begun to stand differently. The doors came next. Ezra unhung the wide double doors from the north face and laid them flat in the yard. The frames had twisted so badly over the years that the lower corners no longer matched the sills. He and Micah stripped the iron hinges, cleaned the rust from the pins, and set the doors aside while Ezra cut a new opening in the east wall. Cora watched him mark the new frame with chalk, wider at the bottom than the top. "A 1/4 inch on each side," Ezra said. The frame will pull square once the weight settles. A door hung perfectly plumb on a green frame twists within a season. He rehung the doors on the east wall by the 8th afternoon. They swung true and closed flush against the stop without a single gust catching the outside face. Cora ran her hand along the new jamb and did not speak for a long moment. "Rowan would have liked how it sits," she said at last. "He built the bones straight," Ezra answered. "The wind just tried to talk him out of it." That evening, Ezra sat down at the kitchen table and drew up the second half of the work list. The chinking between the barn logs needed a full replacement along the west face. The hayloft ladder was rotted at 3 rungs. The chicken coop had lost most of its south wall to a summer storm and had been patched only with feed sacks. The well pump needed a new leather washer before the first hard freeze locked the shaft solid. And a windbreak, Ezra kept circling the words on the paper, a proper windbreak along the northwest corner of the pasture, set at the correct distance from the barn, would cut the winter feed loss in half. Cora read the list twice. "The windbreak alone will take a week. 6 days if Micah helps me weave. And if the storms come early," Ezra folded the paper, "then we build until they arrive and we finish what we can from inside the wall of what already stands." The next morning, hoofbeats came down the frozen road before sunrise. Silas Marrow rode in on a tall bay gelding, his coat trimmed with beaver fur, his hat brushed clean. Behind him came a young ranch hand named Jonas Reeve who kept his eyes on his saddle horn and did not greet anyone. Silas dismounted at the barn and walked its length without asking permission. He stopped where the new sill met the stone. He pressed his gloved thumb against the mortar. He looked up at the ridge beam, then at the newly hung east doors. "So this is the drifter's barn," he said. Ezra rested the head of his hammer against a joist. "It is Mrs. Ashfield's barn. I only work here." Silas turned to Cora, who had come around the corner with an armful of split kindling. "You are pouring good money after a lost cause, Cora. This land will not carry another bad winter. Sell to me now and I will pay off the Butte note myself. You keep the house and 40 acres. You keep your pride." "I keep my land," Cora said evenly, "and my pride does not need your protection." Silas smiled the kind of smile that did not touch his eyes. He glanced once more at the east doors, then at the drainage ditch cut cleanly along the uphill slope. "Winter is not moved by carpentry," he said. "It comes as it comes, and when it does, you will remember I offered." He mounted his horse without another word. Jonas Reeve turned his gelding to follow, but as he passed the barn, his eyes flicked once toward the new sill and lingered a moment too long. Ezra caught the look and filed it away without comment. When the 2 men had ridden out of sight, Micah stepped out from behind the woodshed. He had heard everything. "What if he is right?" the boy asked quietly. Ezra crouched down so he was level with his son's face. "Then we change it before the snow does. That is the only answer winter respects." Cora watched them from the doorway. She said nothing. But that afternoon, when Ezra returned to the barn, he found a fresh mug of chicory coffee waiting on the workbench, still steaming. The windbreak began on the 9th morning. Ezra staked out the line 32 feet northwest of the barn, angled to catch the prevailing winter wind at a slight bias rather than head-on. He had learned years earlier along the northern Pacific line that a windbreak set square to the wind became a wall the storm climbed over and slammed down behind. A break set at an angle bled the wind sideways and let it lose its teeth. The frame would be lodgepole pine, 6 posts sunk 4 feet into the ground, cross-braced with green willow. The weaving would be loose enough to let a hand slip between the branches. Ezra explained the reasoning to Micah as they drove the first post. "A break that stops everything is not a break. It is a cliff, and behind every cliff the wind digs a hole." Micah measured the spacing between posts with a knotted cord. When he asked why the last post stood closer to the barn than the others, Ezra pointed to a low spot in the ground. "The wind will curl there when it hits the corner. If we leave the same gap, it will punch through. Close the gap, and it slides past." Cora came out with a length of red flannel and tied strips at 3 heights along the frame, "so we can see what the wind is doing before it tells us the hard way." By the afternoon of the 10th day, half the willow had been woven into place. Ezra tested the wall with a bucket of loose chaff, tossing it upward from the windward side. The chaff drifted through the willow and lost its speed within a few feet of the barn wall. He adjusted 3 sections where the weave was too tight, then 2 more where it was too loose. Cora watched the flannel strips move. "It breathes," she said. "That is the whole trick," Ezra answered. "A living windbreak. Not a dead wall." That evening, Prudence Hollies returned with news that traveled faster than Silas Marrow's horse. The bank in Butte had sent a rider through the basin the day before, checking on properties that carried notes. He had stopped at Silas Marrow's ranch for 2 hours. He had not stopped at Iron Creek Hollow at all. Cora set down her cup. "He passed my gate. He passed your gate and rode straight to Marrow's kitchen," Prudence said. "Whatever they discussed, it took the better part of the afternoon." Ezra had been quietly repairing a broken rung on the hayloft ladder near the kitchen door. He set the tool down. "How much time is left on your note?" Cora did not answer at once. She looked at the ledger on the shelf, then at Rosalie asleep in her padded crate. "The next payment is due the first week of February. I have most of it. What I do not have, I was counting on from the winter milk and the spring calves. And if the winter goes badly, then I lose the farm." The words settled into the room the way frost settles onto glass. Micah looked up from his bowl of beans. Rosalie stirred once in her sleep and did not wake. Ezra picked up the ladder rung again and began to shape it slowly with his knife. "Then we work as though every day matters," he said finally, "because it does." Cora nodded once. She did not thank him. She did not need to. Prudence stayed the night in the small room off the kitchen. Before she left the next morning, she pulled Ezra aside on the porch. Her breath frosted in the pale sunrise. "That man Marrow does not forgive being told no," she said. "He waited 2 winters for Cora to fail on her own. Now that you are here, he will not wait any longer. Watch your back and watch the fence lines." Ezra thanked her. He did not tell her about Jonas Reeves' lingering glance at the new sill. He filed it away for later, alongside every other small fact he had gathered since arriving. That afternoon, while Ezra was up on the hayloft rebuilding the ladder, Cora climbed into the loft with a wool blanket over one arm and a folded paper in her hand. She unfolded the paper and laid it flat on a bale between them. It was the deed to Iron Creek Hollow, written in Rowan's hand and signed the day he had bought the land. "I want you to know what you are helping me hold," she said quietly. "Not so you feel obligated, so you understand what winter is trying to take." Ezra looked at the deed for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I understand," he said. He returned to shaping the ladder rung. Cora stayed a while longer, watching the wind move the flannel strips on the new windbreak below. The first hard snow came on the 11th day, earlier than any almanac had promised. Ezra was fitting the new south wall of the chicken coop when the wind shifted at mid-morning, and the sky closed over the ridge like a lid dropping onto a kettle. Within an hour, snow was falling in the sideways slant that meant business. Ezra worked faster. He nailed the last plank into place, hung the coop door on its fresh hinges, and hauled the tools inside before the drifts began. Cora had already brought the milk cows into the barn and started laying fresh straw in the stalls. Micah carried armloads of split wood from the shed to the porch while Rosalie watched from the kitchen window, her small palm pressed flat against the glass. By dusk, 6 inches of new snow lay across the yard. By midnight, the drifts had begun to build along the northwest corner of the pasture, exactly where the windbreak now stood. Ezra pulled on his coat and stepped out with a lantern to watch. The willow wall was working. The drifts were piling up on the windward side of the break, not against the barn. The flannel strips fluttered but did not tear. The east doors of the barn stayed clear. Cora came out behind him with a second lantern. She stood beside him without speaking for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "It holds." "For tonight," Ezra answered. "The real test will come when the wind runs above 40. She looked at him sidelong. "You never claim a thing before it earns the claim. A man who claims too early buries the truth under his own words." She smiled faintly. "Rowan used to say something close to that." They walked back to the house together, their lanterns swinging in slow arcs against the dark. By the 14th morning, the storm had passed, and the yard glittered under a hard blue sky. The temperature had dropped to 15 below. Ezra walked the property with his chalk stick and a notebook, marking every place the storm had exposed a weakness. 2 rails on the pasture fence had cracked under the drift weight. A section of the barn's south wall had a small draft where a knot had fallen out of an old plank. The well pump handle was stiff with frozen grease and needed to be pulled and repacked. He fixed each one before supper. That evening, a rider came down the road from the south. Not Silas Marrow this time. A man Ezra did not know, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin with a leather satchel slung across his chest. He introduced himself as Marcus Halloran, the loan officer from the bank in Butte. Cora invited him inside without hesitation and set a mug of hot coffee in front of him. Marcus Halloran was perhaps 50 years old with the tired eyes of a man who had ridden long miles through cold weather. He accepted the coffee and warmed his hands before he spoke. "Mrs. Ashfield," he said, "I have been asked to conduct a review of the properties in this basin that carry notes with our institution. I stopped at Mr. Marrow's ranch 2 days ago. He suggested I visit your farm as well." "Suggested," Cora repeated. His word was recommended. She nodded slowly. "And what does the bank expect to find?" Marcus Halloran set down his cup. "The bank expects to find whatever is here, Mrs. Ashfield. I make my own report. Mr. Marrow made certain claims about the condition of your property. He indicated that the buildings were failing and the herd was thin. He suggested that a foreclosure this spring would be a formality." He paused. "I would like to see the property myself before I write my findings." Cora rose without hesitation. "Then let me show you." She took him through the barn first. Marcus Halloran walked its length slowly. He knelt at the new sill. He looked up at the ridge beam and traced the line with his eye. He examined the east doors and the fresh chinking along the west wall. He stepped outside and studied the windbreak, the drainage ditch, the repaired chicken coop, the rebuilt hayloft ladder. He said very little. When he had finished the full circuit, he stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at Cora. "Who did this work?" "My foreman," Cora said. "Mr. Callahan." Marcus Halloran turned to Ezra. "How long have you been on this property?" 15 days. The loan officer was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a small notebook from his satchel and made an entry with a stub of pencil. "Mrs. Ashfield, I will write my report tonight. I will note what I have seen. I will not repeat what Mr. Marrow told me because none of it appears to be true." He left before nightfall, riding back toward Butte with the last of the daylight. The days that followed carried a new kind of quiet. Marcus Halloran's visit had shifted something inside the farmhouse, though no one said it aloud. Cora walked with her shoulders squared a little differently. Ezra worked the last of the season's repairs with the steady rhythm of a man who no longer expected to be turned out at any moment. The rest of the windbreak was finished on the 18th day. The chinking along the west barn wall was completed on the 20th. The well pump was pulled apart, cleaned, packed with fresh tallow, and reassembled on the 21st. Ezra tested it in the pale dawn and the water came up clean and steady from the shaft. No groan in the handle, no hitch in the stroke. Cora watched from the kitchen doorway. "You have given me back a farm." "I have given you back a winter," Ezra corrected. "The farm is yours. It always was." That evening, Rosalie took her first steps across the kitchen floor. She had been pulling herself up on the chairs for a week, but that night she let go of the table leg and walked 4 unsteady paces before catching Cora's outstretched hand. Cora scooped her up without a word, but her eyes shone in a way Ezra had not seen before. Micah watched from the corner of the room, and for the first time since they had crossed the county line, he laughed out loud. Later, when the children were asleep, Cora sat down at the table across from Ezra and laid a small wooden box in front of him. She lifted the lid. Inside was a set of carpenter's calipers, worn smooth at the pivot, the brass polished by years of use. "They were Rowan's," she said. "He would want a working man to have them." Ezra did not reach for the box at once. He looked at her for a long moment. "Cora, these are his." "They were his. Now they are yours if you will take them." He closed his hand around the calipers slowly. They fit his palm as though they had always belonged there. "I will use them well," he said. The second storm arrived on the 24th night. It came without warning, the way the worst storms always do. Ezra was banking the fire in the barn stove when the wind changed direction and the temperature began to drop. Within 20 minutes, the air had gone from 12 above to 8 below. Within an hour, snow was falling in the thick, wind-driven sheets that meant a true blizzard had settled into the basin. Ezra sank the marker posts he had prepared for exactly this situation. 20 of them, each set 18 feet apart, running from the porch of the farmhouse to the east doors of the barn. Each post carried a strip of red flannel at chest height and a small tin bell at the top. In a whiteout, a man could not see the next post. But he could hear the bell if the wind carried right, and he could feel the post with a mittened hand. Cora helped him string the guide rope between the porch rail and the barn door. She wore Rowan's old sheepskin coat with the collar turned up against her jaw. When they had finished, she looked at Ezra with snow already gathering in her hair. "How long do you think it will last?" 2 days at the least, 3 if the wind holds from the north. And the herd? They are in the barn. Water is coming through the pump. The hay is dry. The doors face east now. We have done what could be done, she nodded once. Then we wait. They waited. The storm rose in fury through the first night. By dawn, the world beyond the kitchen window had become a wall of moving white. The temperature dropped to 22 below. The wind climbed above 40 miles an hour, then above 50. The willow windbreak groaned but held. The drifts piled up on the windward side of the wall exactly where they had been designed to gather. At mid-morning of the second day, Ezra pulled on his coat and mittens, clipped himself to the guide rope, and crossed the yard to check on the cattle. The marker post bells rang faintly against the wind. He counted them by touch as he passed. 1, 2, 3, 4. At the 6th post he stopped. Something dark lay against the drift at the base of the wood. He knelt and brushed the snow aside. It was a boy, no more than 16, half frozen and barely breathing. A wool scarf had been wrapped around the boy's face, but the wind had torn it loose. Ezra recognized him at once. It was Jonas Reeve, Silas Marrow's young ranch hand. Ezra pulled the boy upright and slung him across his shoulder. Jonas Reeve weighed less than a full sack of feed. His hands were bare, his gloves lost somewhere in the storm. His cheeks had gone the waxen white that meant frostbite had already begun its work. Ezra reached the porch with the boy still breathing but unresponsive. Cora opened the door before he could shout. She took one look at the frozen figure and moved without hesitation. Lay him by the stove. Not too close. His hands must warm slowly or the blood will burn him. She stripped off the boy's soaked coat and cut away his frozen boots with a kitchen knife. Ezra worked beside her, unwrapping the ruined scarf, checking the pulse at the boy's throat. It was there. Faint, but there. Micah brought a stack of dry wool blankets from the chest at the foot of Cora's bed. Rosalie, wakened by the sudden activity, watched from the doorway with her small blanket clutched against her chest. Cora heated water on the stove and prepared a shallow basin at a careful temperature, not hot, only warm, and eased Jonas's hands into it slowly. Half an hour passed before the boy's eyes fluttered open. Another half hour before he could form a word. When he did, the word was a name. Marrow. Cora exchanged a glance with Ezra. She poured a cup of broth from the pot on the stove and held it to the boy's lips. Small sips. You can tell us what happened when you have the strength. Jonas Reeve drank the broth in slow swallows. Color began returning to his face in patches. When he could speak in full sentences, he told them. He had been sent out that morning by Silas Marrow to ride the fence line along the northern boundary of the Marrow Ranch, where it met the edge of Iron Creek Hollow. Silas had told him to check for downed rails and to report back before the storm worsened. But Silas had not told him the storm was already on top of them. By the time Jonas reached the fence line, the wind had shifted and the whiteout had begun. His horse had panicked and thrown him against a post. He had walked for 2 hours in the wrong direction before he saw a red flannel strip fluttering above the snow and had followed it until he collapsed. He knew, Jonas said quietly, staring into his cup. He knew the storm was coming. He looked at the sky before I rode out. He told me to hurry. I thought he meant to hurry the work. He meant to hurry me under. Cora sat very still. Ezra spoke first. Why would he want you lost in a storm? Jonas swallowed. His voice was hoarse. Because I heard him 2 nights ago. He was talking with a man from Butte. Not the bank man who came to your door. Another man. They were talking about the note on your farm. Mr. Marrow said if the winter did not finish you, he would find another way. He said your foreman was the problem. He said something about the sill. Ezra's jaw tightened. The sill. He said if the barn were to be damaged before the bank made its final report, the farm would fail anyway. He said he had a man who could do it quiet at night and no one would know. Cora rose from her chair. She walked to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the storm. Her back was very straight. When she turned around, her face was calm, but her eyes had the hard glint that Ezra had seen only once before, on the first morning he had arrived at her gate. "When the storm ends," she said, "we ride to Butte, both of us. We take Jonas with us. He tells Marcus Halloran what he has just told us, and then we let the law decide what Silas Marrow has been planning." Ezra nodded slowly. "And if the man he sent comes before the storm ends?" Cora looked at the shotgun that hung above the kitchen door. It had been Rowan's. She had cleaned it and oiled it every autumn since he had died, though she had never once taken it down. "Then he finds me awake," she said. The storm held them inside for 2 more days. Jonas slept most of it through, his hands slowly regaining feeling under the careful watch of Cora's warm compresses. Ezra took the shotgun down from its pegs and cleaned it a second time. He did not load it in the house, but he set the shells within reach on the kitchen shelf. On the 3rd morning, the wind died. The sky broke open into a hard, cloudless blue. The world beyond the window was silent and blinding white. They waited another half-day before setting out. The road to Butte would be buried in most places, and Ezra wanted to be certain the wind had truly finished before they committed to the ride. He hitched the sturdier of Cora's 2 draft horses to the sled that Rowan had built years before for exactly this kind of winter travel. Cora packed a satchel with dry biscuits, a jar of preserved meat, and 2 extra wool blankets. Jonah's Reeve, still weak but able to sit upright, was wrapped in the heaviest of the sheepskins and settled into the sled bed. Prudence Hollis came down the road at mid-morning on her shaggy mule, having heard from a passing freighter that the storm had done its worst along the northern basin. She listened to what Cora and Ezra told her, her lined face growing tighter with each sentence. "I will stay with the children," she said. "Micah and I will manage the stove and the stock. You take that boy to the bank man and you tell him everything. And you tell the sheriff before you tell anyone else." Cora embraced the old woman briefly. It was the first time Ezra had seen her embrace anyone since he had arrived. Then she climbed onto the sled bench. Ezra took up the reins, and they set off south along the road toward Butte. The ride took the better part of the day. The horse broke trail through drifts that reached above her chest in places. Ezra walked beside the sled for long stretches to spare her weight. Cora took the reins when he grew tired. Jonas slept in the sled bed, waking occasionally to sip from the flask of warm broth Cora had wrapped in wool. They reached Butte after sundown. The town was still shaking off the storm, with shopkeepers digging out doorways and boys shoveling paths between the boardwalks. Ezra drove the sled to the sheriff's office first, as Prudence had counseled. Sheriff Elias Doran was a broad, gray-bearded man of perhaps 60, who had held his post through 3 governors and knew every rancher in the basin by name. He listened to Jonas Reeves' account without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. He wrote down the answers. Then he sent his deputy to fetch Marcus Halloran from the boarding house where the bank kept a room for its officers. Marcus Halloran arrived within the half-hour. He recognized Cora at once. He listened to Jonas a second time. When the boy had finished, the lone officer sat quietly for a long moment. "I suspected something was not right when I visited Mr. Marrow," he said at last. He was too eager to describe the condition of a property he claimed not to have inspected recently, and too specific about the timing of the note. "I did not know what he was planning, but I knew he was planning something." Sheriff Doran rose from his chair. "I will ride out to Marrow's ranch in the morning with 2 deputies. Jonas, you will stay in town under my protection until this is settled. Mrs. Ashfield, Mr. Callahan, you have my word that no man will touch your barn tonight or any night." Cora nodded once. She did not thank him aloud. She did not need to. They stayed the night at a small hotel 2 blocks from the sheriff's office. Cora took a room with a narrow window that looked out over the snow-covered street. Ezra took the room next door. They spoke briefly in the hallway before turning in. "Whatever comes tomorrow," Ezra said, "you have already won this." "I have not won anything," Cora answered. "I have only refused to lose. That is the same thing in the end." She looked at him for a long moment in the yellow light of the hallway lamp. "Is it?" He did not answer at once. Then he said, "It is when the losing was the only thing that was ever offered to you." She smiled, very faintly, and went into her room. The next morning, Sheriff Doran rode out to the Merrill Ranch with his deputies. What happened there was reported back to Cora and Ezra in the late afternoon, over coffee at the sheriff's kitchen table. Silas Marrow had denied everything at first. Then, when confronted with Jonas Reeves' written statement, and with a second witness, a Butte man who had been at the meeting Jonas overheard, Silas had grown very quiet. He had asked to speak to his lawyer. The sheriff had granted him that courtesy. But the sheriff had also placed him under arrest for conspiracy to commit destruction of property, and given Jonas's testimony about the storm for attempted manslaughter. Cora set down her coffee cup with a hand that did not quite tremble. "He will be tried. He will be tried." They rode back to Iron Creek Hollow the following morning. The sky was clear and the road, though still deep in snow, had been broken by the sled tracks of their outbound journey. Cora sat beside Ezra on the bench with the wool blanket drawn across both their laps. Neither of them spoke much for the first hour. There was no need. The silence between them had become its own kind of conversation. When they crested the last rise and saw the farm below them, the barn standing straight against the snow, the willow windbreak holding its line, smoke rising steady from the farmhouse chimney, Cora let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding since they left Butte. "It is still here," she said. "It was always going to be," Ezra answered. "You built it to be." She looked at him. "We built it to be." Prudence Hollis met them at the door with Rosalie balanced on one hip and Micah at her side. The old woman had kept the fire and the stock through their absence without complaint. She took one look at their faces and knew the news was good. She embraced Cora, then she embraced Ezra, which surprised him more than anything that had happened in Butte. The trial of Silas Marrow was held in the spring, after the roads had opened. He was convicted on both counts and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. His ranch was sold at auction to pay his legal debts. A young couple from Bozeman bought the eastern half. Cora Ashfield bought the western half, using a loan that Marcus Halloran arranged personally, and merged it with Iron Creek Hollow. The combined property became one of the largest working farms in the basin. Ezra did not marry Cora that spring. There was too much work, and neither of them was in a hurry to speak of what did not need speaking. But in the summer, when the pasture had greened and the new calves stood beside their mothers in the long grass, Ezra came in from the field one evening and found Cora sitting on the porch with a folded paper in her lap. She handed it to him without a word. It was a deed. Half of Iron Creek Hollow with his name written beside hers in Marcus Halloran's careful hand. "You do not owe me this," Ezra said quietly. "I am not giving you what was mine," Cora answered. "I am nomming what you already carry." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down beside her on the porch step. Rosalie was chasing a butterfly across the yard. Micah was riding one of the draft horses bareback along the fence line, his laughter carrying on the summer wind. "I came here asking for a meal," Ezra said. "I remember. I did not mean to owe you a life. You do not owe me one, but there is one here if you mean to share it." He nodded slowly. "I mean to share it." They were married in the autumn, in a small ceremony at the farmhouse witnessed by Prudence Hollis, Marcus Halloran, Sheriff Doran, and Jonas Reeve, who had stayed on at Iron Creek Hollow as a hired hand and become something close to an older brother to Micah. The wedding was brief. The supper afterward was long. Micah began calling Cora Ma in the second winter, without ever making a formal decision to do so. It came out one evening when he was tired and hungry and asking for bread, and no one at the table remarked on it, and after that it was simply the word he used. Rosalie had never known any other word for her. Years later, when Micah was grown and had taken over the day-to-day running of the farm, and Rosalie had gone east to teach school, and Ezra's beard had turned mostly white, he and Cora would sit on the same porch step in the summer evenings and watch the light fade across the pasture. The barn still stood straight. The willow windbreak had thickened into a living wall. The drainage ditch he had dug that first autumn still ran clean along the uphill slope. "You know what I remember most?" Cora asked him one evening. "Tell me. The first morning you walked the property with your chalk stick, before you had lifted a single tool, you said the wall was not falling because it was built poorly. You said it was falling because the land shifted around it." "I remember. That was the moment I knew you would stay." Ezra smiled. He reached for her hand. "The land shifts," he said. "The ones who stay learn to shift with it." The sun went down over Iron Creek Hollow. The lamps came on in the farmhouse windows, and somewhere in the barn a new calf found its footing in the straw. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, family, and the quiet strength of people who refuse to be broken by winter, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves frontier tales, and leave a comment telling us which part moved you most. Peace.